I grew up in an affluent white American suburb outside of Boston in the 60s. We had a leak in the roof. We called the roof guy. I mean, in a lot of neighborhoods, you have a leak in your roof, you go talk to your neighbors about, hey, you got a 30-foot ladder, and suddenly there's three guys up on a roof. That's the human norm. And as you get more affluent, you don't need that. You hire someone to fix your roof, and there is the loss of communality and reciprocity. And that's one of the really sad losses of affluence in this society.
Rates of depression, rates of suicide, rates of feeling alone, and all of that actually increase dramatically as you go up the economic ladder.
Affluence is not without its downside. So there's two kinds of affluence.
When I first started reading Freedom, I almost had it in my head that you were somewhere in like 1930s USA Industrial Revolution. Like you're walking a railroad through Pennsylvania, and there's this underbelly, this culture, this subculture of, you know, people shooting at you and guys with snake hooks and all this stuff. Like, how recent was that? I mean, I'm assuming this is in the last few years, but how recent was this experience that you had?
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of go back in time by going to different places, right? And the railroad lines are there. It's illegal to be on them, and there's sort of these swaths of no man's land. We walked from Washington D.C. to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh along the lines, and we were sleeping under bridges and cooking over fires and dodging the police and whatever else, and so it was in the last 10 years, but there were times, particularly in central Pennsylvania, which, I mean, even the towns feel like out of the Depression. I mean, just it doesn't feel of this era, and the accents that the people speak with, and the people, and the houses, and the roads, and it really feels like from a different time. And we walked right through it, and we were on the lines, and then we'd run out of food. We carried everything we needed, and we'd run out of food, and we'd walk into town and buy food and a pack of cigarettes, and then go back out onto the lines. And so that, we weren't independent of civilization. We actually needed it, but we also had to stay out of its sort of scrutiny.
Makes sense. When you did this was for a year that you did this with a couple of other people and a dog. Was the intention to explore the concept of freedom, or did this personal freedom concept reveal itself on the piggyback of what you learned in Tribe?
Yeah, it was off and on for a year. We covered about 400 miles, and we did that in sort of 50 to 100 mile chunks, for a variety of reasons. But it was actually a good way to divide it up. No, I wasn't interested in freedom when we started out on that. The way this came about was I took an Amtrak down to D.C. with Tim Hetherington, who I made Restrepo with, and of course, he was killed in 2011 in combat in Libya, and. But we were on the train. I was sort of staring out the window, and I said, "Tim, man, we could walk this whole thing. There's almost the whole way. There's like a dirt bike road, or a maintenance road, or a woods, or a cornfield, or we go through the ghettos and go through this or that." I was like, we could do this on foot, and he was sort of, yeah, we could, yeah, that sounds great, But we tentatively had the idea to do it, and then he got killed. So I took a couple of guys I knew out in Afghanistan, a couple of combat vets, and then another journalist named Guillermo, who was Spanish. Guillermo was holding Tim's hand when Tim died. Tim bled out in the back of a pickup truck. And it happened to be Guillermo who was sitting with him trying to help him. And so Guillermo and I became very good friends, and we just decided to walk along the railroad lines for 400 miles to encounter America and to sort of decommission ourselves from combat. It felt like the railroad, that environment had a lot of the good things in combat, and arguably none of the bad things, like killing people. So it was our way of sort of like re-encountering our country. And much later, as I was writing my book Freedom, I thought to myself, when's the freest you've ever been, right? And that completely depends on how you define it. I'm financially, I'm pretty well off right now, so I have economic freedom, but I have two young children, so I don't have temporal freedom. So take your pick. Like, depends on your definition. But I realized on what we called the last patrol, is what we called this trip. Every night, we were the only people who knew where we were, under what bridge, in what cornfield, in what abandoned building, and that also is a form of freedom, although it's hard won. And so I put the narrative of that trip into my book on freedom because it seemed like a living example of one way to be autonomous.
The line that jumped out to me in the book above everything else, I didn't even know where it was, but it hit me in the face, was that personal freedom and safety are on a spectrum, And the more you have of one, the less you have of the other. Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that mean? The more of one you have than the other, or less you have of the other, excuse me.
We're social primates, right? And we are not ourselves very well adapted to defend ourselves. We don't have sharp teeth. We don't have long claws. We can't climb trees very well. We don't run very fast. Our safety comes from our collaboration with others. And in groups, humans not only survive, but dominate. I mean, we dominate the world. We can counter any threat, right? And if once you're part of a group, you're bound by the group's rules, by the group's expectations, right? And so if you're completely by yourself in the wilderness, yes, you are completely free, right? You don't owe anything to anyone. You can do anything you want, but you almost certainly will die. Humans don't survive in the wilderness very well on their own. Um, if you're part of a group, your odds of survival go up, but it means at night you got to get you got to someone's got to get water, right? Someone's got to build a fire. Someone's got to stand sentry. So I mean you have obligations that go towards the welfare and the safety of the group. So take your pick: total autonomy, zero safety, much better safety, but you owe a certain amount of your waking existence to the welfare of others, or the welfare of the group. And if you're not willing to do that, the group will kick you out. They're like, we don't need you. You're not willing to contribute. You can take a hike. And that was very, very clear on the American frontier. My ancestors on my mother's side were homesteaded in Western Pennsylvania in the 1780s and 1770s. And their homestead was actually attacked by Delaware Indians, and the two teenage boys were killed. And the mom escaped into the cornfield with her 4-year-old and infant, and the husband was away in town that day. I'm descended from that infant. But the deal on the frontier was a very, very dangerous place. But you were really autonomous from the colonial government or from the federal government. But it was extremely dangerous, right? It was, quote, Indian territory, and settlers really didn't survive well on their own. And the idea was that if you were out there and there was an Indian raid, which happened periodically, all the settlers sort of collected at the stockade, and everyone owed their life to the defense of the stockade, to the defense of the group. And if you were not, as an adult male, and that started at basically age 16, if you were not willing to carry a rifle, what they call the scalping knife, and a tomahawk at all times, and be ready to defend the group to your death, right? If you were not willing to do that, you were not wanted. You were ostracized and shunned and essentially expelled from the community. Very low levels of autonomy within the group in a frontier setting, very high levels of autonomy from the government.
Now, if you fast forward to modern society, as I listen to that, what's up, Tribe listeners? I want to talk about our sponsor for today's episode, Gobundance, the tribe for healthy, wealthy, generous people who choose to live epic lives. It's a tribe I've been a part of for 5 years now, and I keep coming back year after year because of the quality of the connections and interactions that I get and the accountability that I get toward the goals that I'm looking to achieve. Gobundance has meant everything to me, so I'm really, really proud to sit here on the Tribe of Millionaires podcast and tell you a little bit about Gobundance. Here's the thing. Why do you live where you live? Think about it. Why do you live in the neighborhood you live in, or the apartment building you live in, or wherever it might be? Usually, people move into a community because of the quality of the neighbors and all of the amenities that are available to them. And then they go about using those amenities and leveraging that community to the best of their ability for growth. They make connections with neighbors, lifelong friendships, things that serve them. We want that for ourselves, for our wives or husbands, and our children. That's what Gobundance is at the next level. Imagine if you're a man moving into a community of other millionaire men that are driven toward being the best versions of themselves as fathers, as husbands, in their health, in their relationships, in their contribution, you name it. That's what Gobundance provides. For me, it's been everything. I get with my Gobundance brothers on a weekly basis and I tell them, this is where I'm trying to go. Things I can't share with the regular folks in my life, my friends, my family that I've known forever. They only know me for who I've been. Gobundance guys, they know me only for who I'm becoming. And when I deviate, when I go off course from being that guy, from taking action toward being that guy, that's when they step in, that's when they hold me accountable, and that's what accelerates my growth. Go to Gobundance.com right now and apply. If you're a millionaire and a man, Gobundance.com. If you're a woman and a millionaire, GobundanceWomen.com. And if you're not quite a millionaire, go to GobundanceEmerge.com and you join me in the community that I've created in partnership with Gobundance to get yourself to that place of being what we call a whole life millionaire. Gobundance.com. You can start there, see everything that we have to offer. It's an incredible community. I can't wait for you to be a part of it. Now, back to the show. I get in that time, in that period, in that situation, in those situations where, yeah, you owe something to the group, which limits your personal freedom but increases your safety. And we can get into, I think you talk about Gini coefficients later, which is really interesting. But what about in modern society? So somebody listening to this might say, well, wait a minute. I can do it all on my own. I don't need a group. I don't need anybody. I can forage forward and take care of everything on my own. We're not in colonial or colonial times anymore. Is that an illusion that somebody is personally free today if they have no group or they perceive that they have no group that they belong to?
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of subcontracted the issues of defense and survival to specialists. So there are firefighters who live in their own dedicated housing and will rush to your house and risk their lives to save you if your house catches fire. On the frontier, fires invariably started in the wattle and daub, like stick and mud chimneys that they built. And every chimney had a rope attached to the top. And when the chimney caught fire, everyone ran outside and pulled the chimney down so it wouldn't burn the rest of the house. There were no firemen, right? Likewise, we have the Coast Guard, we have the Army, we have the police force. We are counting on those professionals for our basic safety. We also are counting on a supply chain. You're like, well, I hunt for my food. Well, okay, but the steel that your rifle's made out of, you didn't make that, right? I mean, the gasoline you're putting in your truck, you didn't drill that, right? When you need surgery, you're not operating on yourself. When you need eyeglasses, I mean, you're not grinding your own eyeglass lenses. I mean, I'm sorry, there's no one in a modern industrial society that does not need, that is surviving completely on their own in a material sense. It's complete nonsense. And so we confine the obligation back to society. We confine it to paying taxes. You're actually not obligated to maintain a firearm and good standing with the local militia. You're not obligated to do that as you were in colonial times. You don't have to clean up you don't have to clean up trash from the local park. If you want to, that's great, but you don't have to. You don't have to do anything but pay your taxes. I would argue that if in recognition of all of our debt to society, you really should contribute blood. You should donate blood. My life was saved. I had a sort of medical disaster. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, just a congenital deformity, and it ruptured. And I bled out. I lost 2/3 of my blood. I got to the ER at my blood pressure was 60/40, and I only survived because they put 10 units of blood into my neck. Right?
Wow. Yeah.
Donate blood. Right? That's your obligation as a human and as a citizen. Serve jury duty. Likewise, like jury duty is the only thing that keeps individuals from deciding the fate of another person. No small town sheriff, no American president, no congressman, no head of a corporation. Nobody can decide what's going to happen to someone else. Only a jury of peers. And finally, vote. I would add a profanity after that if I could, but I won't. Vote.
Fucking vote.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the country needs you to vote. If you don't vote, you don't have the right to live in a democracy. Sorry, move to Russia, move to Somalia. Yeah, but don't not vote and complain about this country. And if the vote doesn't go the way you wish it had, then celebrate, because that means you live in a democracy, right? And you're going to accept the other side's going to win, and that means you live in a democracy. And then when you win, they have to accept it, and that means we live in a democracy. Like, sorry, that's how it works. And again, if you don't like it, there's Somalia. You can do whatever you want over there. Like, go for it.
Yeah. I live in the Dominican Republic. My family moved here. We're doing a year down here just for the adventure of it and to explore a new place. And across the border in Haiti, I mean, you want to talk about a place that is falling apart. I mean, it's literally hell on earth. To your point, I think sometimes we do take for granted just how great we have it in a country like the U.S. You know, like the opportunities that we have is probably the best way to put it, because there are places on earth that are absolutely hellish. Somalia, you mentioned, Haiti, I mentioned. So no, that makes a lot of sense. In that vein, I thought this was interesting. This is back in the book Tribe. You chronicled, I guess, civilized individuals that were either captured by or voluntarily went to Indian reservations, American Indian reservations, and voluntarily stayed, even if they were captured. They integrated with that society, but the opposite never happened. Indian societies or Indian tribes never tried to integrate with white settlers at that time. What does that say? Why is that around personal freedom? Like, do we value? I don't know. What does that mean? What does that say about our personal freedoms?
Yeah. So first of all, these weren't reservations. These were tribes that were still autonomous and had not signed treaties with the U.S. government and settled onto reserves. Right. These were autonomous tribes that were fighting for their independence along the Pennsylvania frontier, for example, in Ohio, and on westwards all the way to Arizona and the Southwest. So people like Benjamin Franklin and some other writers of the colonial era remarked, in other words, don't take my word for it, people of the era, writers, thinkers, intellectuals of the era noted that often people who had been captured along the frontier in Indian raids of the sort that my ancestors had to flee, and adopted into tribes often refused to go home when given the chance. Um, okay, Stockholm syndrome, if you want to call it that. But there were also many, many incidents of people just willingly getting up and leaving and joining native society. And I think the reason is like these were, I mean, farming is really hard, right? Farming with horses in the rocky Pennsylvania soil is backbreaking work, right? The religion of the era was an extremely harsh, judgmental, moralistic religion. Sexual freedom was virtually zero, right? There was a very powerful church and economic hierarchy within those societies. And then you had sort of native society, which is quite typically of hunter-gatherer economies, is fairly egalitarian, right? There were very few of the Native American tribes was there a great accumulation of wealth. You could not inherit, you could not pass on authority. Authority was given to people um, because they were persuasive, right? I mean, leaders were respected because they were persuasive, not because they had life and death power over other people. And unlike, say, the King of England or the King of France, who could order anyone executed that they wanted, it's a very unfair system, and likewise in the colonies. So what the native peoples offered was a close, egalitarian, communal system that had the kind of sexual liberty that we have in today's America, um, and they didn't. There was no arbitrary power. And one of the great things about living in an economy where people are able to provide for their own survival is that if you don't like the leadership, you can pull up your tent pegs in the middle of the night and just leave. Right? You don't need this or that chief to survive. You can just go move in with your cousins in another band in another tribe. Right? So that kind of freedom, particularly with the young men, like, I mean, we get to dress in deerskin leggings and basically have all the sex we want with willing women and hunt instead of farm. Like, are you kidding? Like, that's the deal you're offering us? I am out of here, right? And but all over the world you see this terrible the comparison between agricultural society and a hunting society is one that the agricultural societies never ever win, right? It's just not a good look. It's not fun. And it's typified by these sort of like top-down hierarchies where individual rights are really quite limited. And I'll end with this. The Great Wall of China. Many historians believe that the Great Wall of China was built as much to keep the Chinese farmers in than to keep the quote Mongol hordes, Genghis Khan's warriors, keep them out. The Genghis Khan society was enormously appealing for the same reasons that the Apache were and the Delaware were, and it was all the Chinese could do to keep the farmers in their rice paddies.
Could the book, I mean, in Freedom, really, it's an exploration of the balance between personal freedom and, I guess, the need we are as tribal beings for community. I hope I'm saying that in a way that's effective. But could the book have as easily been named Happiness? Is it synonymous?
Well, yeah, happiness is a very elusive. It's very hard to measure happiness, right? And there are people that are leading enormously meaningful live existences that they will remember and even miss for the rest of their lives, but they're not happy. I would say that the frontline soldiers in Ukraine, I think it would be a challenge to describe them as happy, but they are doing something profoundly meaningful. And we know from other wars, including with American soldiers, that the ones who survive often miss those meaningful days of danger and brotherhood and hardship. So happiness is, it's like comfort and convenience. Like, yeah, it feels good for a little while, but you don't want to make happiness, comfort, and convenience the high gods that you're chasing your whole life, right? And there are other things like uh, living a life that feels meaningful, that feels connected to other people, that where you feel authentic and needed by others. Like, I mean, those are the lives that give people enormous satisfaction. Happiness is in some ways quite an ephemeral thing, and it comes and goes very, very quickly.
That's fair. That makes a lot of sense. Can't measure happiness. How do you or can you measure freedom?
Yeah, I mean, you can measure happiness. It's just you can't do it very accurately, and it's not very long lasting. So well, again, freedom. I mean, measure it. Try defining it first. Geez, I mean, economic freedom. Well, you better have a great job, and if you're a corporate lawyer, you have economic freedom. You're working 120 hours a week, but if money's your thing, corporate law is your answer, right? Like that's your freedom. If free time is your thing, try homelessness, right? I mean, like. Well, I don't mean to sound glib, but I mean seriously. There are people who are living. I mean, we met many of them on the railroad lines who are enormous stresses and hardships in their lives. But I tell you what, they are the owners of their day.
Mm.
I mean, they own their time, and um, I wouldn't want either one. I mean, if I had to pick between homeless and a corporate lawyer, I think I'd go for the sleeping under the bridge. I've done it plenty, but it really depends how you define it. And right now, I came to fatherhood late. One of the great constraints on freedom is yourself, right? Is your ego,
Yeah.
right? And when you sort of lose your ego, as hopefully happens a little bit in parenthood, it's an enormous liberation. I have these two little girls, 6 and 3, and they are the entire point of my existence right now, and that's a great emotional. That's a great liberation from this just constant ambitious sort of like um, chasing of things that I wanted when I was 30 and 40, right? I mean, it's like, oh, finally, I'm just like, here I am, good. I'm sitting in a playground with my little girl, and I want absolutely nothing. I don't care what I look like. I don't care what, if I write another bestseller, could care less. Like, so it, and I'll end with this, like, in a society, in a free society, in a society where our freedom is incorporated into our political system, into our laws, where our individual freedom is protected by our laws and our political system. Often the threat to our freedom is internal and comes in the form of addiction, right? If you are addicted to drugs and alcohol, of course you're not a free person. If you're addicted to your iPhone, which is very, very clearly an addictive behavior, the algorithms were designed to addict us. If you do walk around and look at people's behavior, they are clearly addicted to the thing in their hand. And if it was if they were carrying a piece of wood or a rock or looking at their wedding ring, you would think, wow, you're an obsessive compulsive. You've been staring at that rock the entire subway ride. Go get diagnosed, brother. You got a problem,
So
right?
true. So
So
true.
so if you're addicted, compulsive shopping, right? I mean, 3/4 of Americans die in debt, right? Because the culture, capitalist culture, and I'm all for capitalism, but it does get people to buy shit that they don't need, right? So if that's, in some ways, that is the threat to our freedom. It's internal, and I promise, end with this. I
No.
interviewed a guy who had done 25 years in prison for a crime that he committed, right? Like he committed it. He committed the crime. He regrets it, of course. Prison changed him profoundly. He found God, he found books, he found reading, he found enlightenment, he found education, he found himself, right? And I interviewed him about 2 weeks after he got out, a few years early for good behavior. And I said, listen, man, I feel stupid even asking this, but is it possible to be more free in prison
Hmm.
than outside of prison? Right? And he, he looked at me like I was crazy. He was like, of course it is, man. Are you freaking kidding? Of
Wow.
course it is. There's no smartphones in prison. There's very little television. It's very hard to get drugs, alcohol. Like you got no distractions at all in prison. All you got is time. And with all that time, eventually you're going to have an honest conversation with yourself about who you really are and what you're doing with your life. And when you have that conversation, you're a free man. And there's a lot of people on the outside who never, ever even have that conversation with themselves. And when they die unfree.
Incredible. Wow, that's a fascinating story. That's a freedom in prison. I mean, I guess in the context of how I've read it, how you've described it, it makes sense. It really does. When you ask the question and me thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, it probably is. Probably is a way that you can be. And to that end, we talk about, so look, this podcast, Tribe of Millionaires, is the marketing front, the face of a mastermind group called Gobundance, right? Which is on my shirt. It's a high net worth men's entrepreneurial networking group, right? Peer-to-peer networking group. So this is a group of men who have done things successfully in their lives financially and find themselves maybe on an island. The higher and higher that we climb the pole or whatever, you find yourself on an island. And you literally chronicled that in your book. Rates of depression, rates of suicide, rates of feeling alone, and all of that actually increase dramatically. Tell me if I'm saying that wrong, as you go up the economic ladder, right? So searching for and finding tribe for us, like it's hard to sort of explain the value to other people. People are like, wait, you pay to hang out with other people? And it's like, yeah, we pay a good chunk to hang out with other people that are of like mind or of similar situations, because it's one of, you mentioned it, you need authenticity, you need to be authentic, you need to be competent in what you do, and you need a community to bond with, right? Those are the three human needs, right? Essentially. And that last one is lacking when you diverge from, say, the norm. So I don't know. I'm just going to lay that on. It looks like you have something to say, so go for it.
Yeah. So there's two. So look, wealth is great, and there are many virtues to having wealth. And poverty is an enormous. It's dangerous. It's an enormous stressor. Um, there are some advantages to not being um, overly focused on the material world. I'll put it that way.
Sure.
Right? Like, affluence is not without its downside. And so there's two kinds of affluence. There's being personally wealthy, and then there's being in an affluent society. So you can be poor in an affluent society. I mean, of course, there's many poor people in America, and you can be very, very wealthy in a poor society. There are billionaires in Nigeria, and it's an extremely poor country because it's so corrupt. Uh, what the data shows is that psychological disorders, mental health disorders, tend to go up with with affluence in society. So rates of depression tend to be higher in modern, more affluent societies than in rural, poorer societies, say in Africa. Rates of depression, suicide, PTSD, anxiety. Right now, half of all, I mean, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, right? And certainly the most powerful by many measures. I think something like half of Americans say that they're depressed.
Mm.
Are you kidding? Like, and I'm not saying we should do something else. Maybe depression is a completely acceptable price to pay for the vast benefits of American affluence. Like, I don't know. It's not, that's not up for me to decide, but it must be understood that there are negative consequences for affluence in a society. Um, and something like a half of teenage girls have extreme anxiety right now. A lot of it, of course, is connected to smartphone use and social media. I mean, the mental health measures went off a cliff around 2012, 2015, when social media was housed on smartphones that could be carried in the pocket, and you had access to that shit 24/7, and basically depression and anxiety and suicide just skyrocketed among teenagers in particular, particularly girls. And so I think the trick is, if you're if you say you're an American and you're successful, you're a hardworking corporate lawyer or author or whatever, like you're doing well, you figured it out, right? Good on you, absolutely. Like you're a smart person, you figured it out. And the problem with being personally affluent is that you can buy your way out of problems, and you don't need to knock on someone's door for a for some butter or some salt or whatever you might need. I mean, in a sort of more in a more pedestrian neighborhood, people need things from their neighbors, right? Hey, do you have any butter? Do you have any chocolate? My kid? I got to run out. Can you watch my kids for a little while? That's a normal human interaction that wealthy people, and I grew up like this. I grew up in an affluent white American suburb outside of Boston in the 60s and 70s. We didn't know our neighbors at all, much less ask them for anything. We had a leak in the roof. We called the roof guy, right? Like, I mean, in a lot of neighborhoods, you have a leak in your roof. You go talk to your neighbors about, hey, you got a 30-foot ladder because I got it, da da da. And suddenly there's three guys up on a roof, right? I mean, that's the human norm. And as you get more affluent, you don't need that. You hire someone to fix your roof. Great, right? But there is a loss, and there is the loss of communality and sort of reciprocity. You help me with my roof. I know that at some point you're going to call me and ask me to babysit your kid for an hour because you got to run out and do something. And that makes people feel good. That's the thing. It doesn't make them feel obligated and burdened. It makes them feel seen and needed and good. And that's one of the really sad losses of affluence in this society.
You go to that's a great point. And you go to like Maslow, right? Hierarchy of needs. I think about being here in the DR. People here wonder. I get asked all the time, like, well, if people are only making $500-600 a month, how are they surviving? And one, there's zero depression, no depression, because their basic needs are not filled, right? They don't have. If you're the poorest person in the United States, you're still top 1% in the world, right? You've got a lot of government programs, subsidies, whatever, taking care of you or that can take care of you. Here, they don't have that. So they live in multi-generational homes where 3 or 4 adults are making each $500 a month, which allows them to pay for a $200 a month rent, 2-bedroom apartment with no air conditioning, and get food and supplies and healthcare or whatever it might be. So there's a major, major sense of community here, to your point of personal freedom. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's a big piece of it. No, like that needs are not met in those societies. Happiness is, or not happiness, but freedom is higher, which probably makes us a happier society.
Yeah, and that interdependence, I mean, so there's two forms. There's the multi-generational household, which is the human norm. Children sleep with adults in the same area. That makes children feel very safe and connected all night long. They can hear, smell, feel adults around them. Of course, baby primates, which is what children are. Baby primates get their sense of safety from the proximity of adults. And if you're a baby primate in the dark by yourself, you're fucked, right? I mean, in evolutionary terms, you're complete. Like,
Yeah,
forget it.
yeah.
You're somebody's lunch, right? And infants don't know that they're in a safe home, right? All they know is that I'm around adults, right? So if you have grandparents, parents, and children in the same home, you have older children that can look after the younger children. You have grandparents that can look after the older children. It allows for an enormous amount of autonomy when people are at the most active in their lives, which is 20 to 50 or whatever. Like during that time period, you're both a parent and super active in the social world, in the work world. Having grandparents in the home uh, allows for that. And then there's the communality of these families with other families in the neighborhood. I was in Liberia during the Civil War, and I went back with my wife and my eldest daughter, long after the war ended a few years ago, and we were way up country in a very small village of about 100 people, and I mean, the village was completely made from the jungle, right? There was nothing, maybe a little bit of galvanized roofing, but otherwise it was wood and thatch, and you know, there were snakes, there was whatever. I mean, it was a tricky environment, but the power of that group, like during the day, the adults all went out to work in the fields, and this is Swidden agriculture that was it was within the jungle, right? The grandparents and everyone under 7 stayed in the village. So if you were 7 and older, you had to work.
Hmm.
Okay, under 7, you stayed in the village, and the 6-year-olds took care of the younger children. And the youngest infants were on their mother's back in the fields. And I got to tell you, this little village of children that we were in during the day, they were running around, they were playing, they were wrestling, they were working, they were grinding flour out of rice, they were contributing to the group. They're 6 years old, right? I mean, there was 5-year-olds carrying 2-year-olds like they were the babysitter, right? That's that's how primates do it. It's how humans have always done it. Nobody in that situation feels that they're not safe. They're part of this group. They know them very well. Some of the people in that group drive them crazy, of course, because there's tension in any human group, right? But it's all this ongoing sort of reciprocity, which is the sort of, in some ways, the point of life. I live in a mixed income / low income Dominican and Puerto Rican neighborhood in New York.
Mm.
We in a very small apartment, 500 square feet. We sleep with my wife and I sleep with our 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. This partly because there isn't room to do otherwise. And but Hurricane Sandy hit about 10 years ago, and it knocked out the power, from 34th Street down in New York City. And so New York City at night without light is a scary place.
Mm.
And because it's a low income neighborhood, so in this building there was no running water because the power was out, and there are a lot of families in this building, which is mostly Spanish speaking, that had young children, and they had to leave. They went to where there was light, further north in the Bronx or whatever. So a lot of the apartments were empty. So the people that were here were worried that there'd be break-ins because there's a criminal element in the neighborhood as well, and they knew damn well that people had vacated their apartments. So this is what they did. They poured cooking oil on the fire escapes to make them impossible to climb down if you're carrying anything. So you could maybe get up the fire escape and break into an apartment, but you could never go back down it with a television set, right? So they coated the fire escapes with cooking oil, and one of the women in the building one of the moms had a machete, right? Probably from DR, right? Had a machete and organized a guard roster of teenage boys at the front door, and the kids just kept passing off the machete on 2-hour guard shifts and guarded the building for 4 days, until the lights came back on. Right now, that's community.
That is community,
right? That's what. And I got to tell you, it's so much happier despite the stresses. Right? It's so much happier than growing up the way I did in an affluent suburb. That was death on wheels.
Is this your? Just curious. This is intentional? It sounds like. Is it long term? I mean, look, knowing your history, you put yourself in some really interesting situations, which then have become books later on. Are we on the path to a book, or is this just my life choice? We want to live in, like you said, a middle to lower income neighborhood, so our kids get exposure to true community and all of that. Why do you live where you live? Look, you wrote The Perfect Storm, for God's sake. So why do you live in that neighborhood?
Well, my wife has lived there for 20 years, and I met my wife and fell in love with her, and moved in, right? I mean, I'm not going to ask her to leave. She loves this apartment. She didn't want to leave. I fell in love with the area. My girls go to public school. We're part of the community. I've known my whole life I will never live in an affluent white community or affluent community of any color. Like it's killing to the soul. It's deadening to the spirit. Like, why would I do that to myself? And look, it's not like this neighborhood's perfect, right? I mean, there's lots of situations I got to keep my eye on and whatever. But I tell you, I feel very much I haven't felt this much part of something since I was in Afghanistan with a platoon of American soldiers, and I felt very much part of that too. And I missed it ever since. And now I have a tiny, tiny little bit of that. And I tell you what, I would stand up for the right thing in this neighborhood in a heartbeat. Like, I wouldn't even hesitate. Whatever that might be, I would stand up for it, as would everyone I know in this neighborhood.
Well, and that speaks to, you talk about this, and we've seen this through history, right? You're in an environment, Hurricane Sandy hits, and your community goes into action. People tend to band together around disasters. Katrina was one, or 9/11. I remember that, at least for a period of time. We were all unified as a nation, right? As a world, we were all unified around the evils of what had happened that day, and so on. The thing you talked about in the book, though, that fascinated me was as far as the Blitzkrieg in London. What was it, like 57 days of bombing, and how depression went down. Psych wards were emptied. Epileptic seizures were less, right? Like just around something as tragic as, people being bombed and dying in the Blitzkrieg. In those tragic settings in wartime, people come together, and rates of depression, rates of mental illness, rates of mental disease seem to come down, or at least they have come down in the past. And that makes a ton of sense. But at the same time, I'm sitting here thinking about COVID. When COVID hit, I mean, maybe at the very beginning for a minute, everybody sort of, had that moment of gratitude. But boy, it seemed to we seemed to factionalize for the first time around something that was worldwide, right? 9/11 didn't factionalize for a long time. Not World War II, World War I, Vietnam, so on and so forth. But that did. And why is that? Why are we in a different time around tribalism? Have we jumped the shark as a society?
Well, our political leaders weaponized it for political ends, right? I mean, maybe, but I mean, I'm a Democrat. I don't think the Democrats particularly did, but certainly Trump did. And they made it an issue. They made it a cultural issue. The GOP, their strategy doesn't seem to be a policy-oriented one at the moment. It seems to be one of sort of leaning into cultural divisions, cultural fights, and trying to win elections that way. Works pretty well. And so, I would say that under different leadership, I would say under Ronald Reagan, um, under Bill Clinton, maybe, I don't know, Jimmy Carter, certainly, that the message coming out of the White House would have been a whole lot more focused on unity rather than mockery and derision of the scientists. I mean, Americans fell for it, but I would say the leadership, in other words, Donald Trump, completely fell down on the job. And in fact, it wasn't even a failure. It was a deliberate act to weaponize the divisions, to create divisions in COVID and then weaponize them. In addition, right? In addition, I mean, George Bush, and I didn't vote for the man, but George Bush didn't divide Americans after 9/11, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
he didn't say things. He said things that brought Americans together. Donald Trump did not do that. Like virtually everything he says divides Americans, right? And but in addition, the tragedy of epidemics is that you're supposed to stay away from each other, right? I mean, during the Blitz in London, which wasn't 57 days, it was 6 straight months. They
Oh, wow.
lost 30,000 civilians, 30,000, 10 times what we lost on 9/11. And afterwards, people said they missed it. And they missed it because the whole society was was working to survive this thing, right? Class distinctions disappeared. The wealthy were buried in the rubble, just like the poor. The wealthy and the poor were sleeping shoulder to shoulder in the tube stations. I mean, there was. I looked at an earthquake that struck Italy in I think it was 1916, in Avezzano. Something like 94% of the population of that area was killed in under a minute. Okay, imagine. It was like they'd been hit by a nuclear bomb. And one of the survivors said, he wrote a book about it. He said that the earthquake accomplished what the law promises, but does not in fact deliver, which is the equality of all men, all people, right? So the problem with epidemics is that you physically can't be near anybody. So it's very hard to feel affiliation with them. In fact, other people might be the thing that kill you, right? The lady who sneezes on the subway, that might have just been what killed you, right? So I think that's a very, very special case.
And with that, just real quick on the like, there's a saying on Twitter years after a tweet comes out, and it's proven wrong or debunked or whatever. It says this tweet didn't age well, right? That's one of those things that people say on social media. I completely agree. The bombasticness of any politician, it doesn't really serve anybody. I do. At the same time, what's going through my mind, honestly, is like, well, but was he wrong, or was it wrong? That movement around, hey, this isn't what it's purported to be. After a couple of months of knowing what we knew, not right out of the gate, but after a couple of months, there's a lot of information back and forth about the vaccine, about what is and isn't accurate, whether or not there's, I don't know, heart issues. I can't think of the exact phrase that people have used around the heart issue that's apparently linked to the vaccine. But in that regard, I'm trying to wrap this in. So it's kind of a 2-part question. One, was there something accurate about that within, when you cut through the bombasticness, was there something accurate about the idea that, hey, look, this needs to be treated a different way than maybe the mainstream is treating it right now? And secondarily, what does that say about our culture today and our tribalism today? Because we are like MAGA woke separated, right? Like that seems to be the extreme ends of both things. So I'll let you unpack that.
Yeah, well, the vaccine was developed under Donald Trump. He himself was vaccinated. He told people to be vaccinated, and now,
True.
if the reports are to be believed, virtually the only people dying of COVID anymore are the unvaccinated. So, are there heart issues? I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but even if there are, I mean, look, seatbelts save lives. Once in a while, there's a car accident where the person burns alive because he can't get out of his friggin' seatbelt. Like, yeah, I get it,
Yeah.
right? But in the sum total of good or harm to the society, like, which way are you going to go? People, all vaccines include that sort of a John Stuart Mill choice of what's the greater good versus the greater harm. And in all vaccines, there is a poor outcome rate of some number, right? But obviously, since the advent of vaccines, 100 years or so ago, the childhood death rates from measles and smallpox and everything else has plummeted to virtually zero. So, do some people that take those vaccines have a bad reaction? Of course they do. But people have bad reactions to antibiotics, right? I ripped my Achilles tendon because I was a mefloquine in Afghanistan, and apparently it can compromise your tendons. And I ruptured my Achilles on a combat patrol,
Mm.
right? So, but I didn't get malaria, like so. That's just a standard medical issue. It got politicized and weaponized by a president who was also taking the vaccine and telling you to take it. Like, it was his commentary on the vaccine was completely contradictory, right? And any president should be. Ronald Reagan wasn't contradictory, right? Jimmy Carter wasn't, right? They sort of figured out what was more or less best for America, and tried to espouse that position. That was not what Trump did, right? And so I'm a Democrat. Whatever. Like, my problem with Trump isn't that he's a Republican.
Right, right, right.
He's that he's a self-serving narcissist, right? Like, there's dozens of Republicans I would vote for and hug if they won, right? Just not Trump. And if Trump were a Democrat, I'd feel exactly the same way about him.
You know who's fascinating? Have you been following Not to get on this, but just for a second, have you been following Robert Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy?
Yeah, I have. Just from the headlines, but yeah.
Yeah, interesting guy. I'm really curious to see. I don't think he has a shot just because he's going against the establishment candidate, the actual existing president. But there's somewhere between the lunacy you hear about him from a headline perspective, and then when you listen to the guy, like anybody, right? When you actually listen to the guy, it's like, you know what? There's some interesting points he makes. There's some science he cites, and there's always reports on both sides. But he is an interesting candidate. So I don't know.
Yeah, I've listened to a few things he said, and he is clearly extremely smart.
Very.
Right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't dissemble, right? Like, I don't agree with him on a whole lot of things.
Sure.
But he's not playing this sort of verbal chess game. I don't know his name well enough to repeat it. Vivek, is it?
Oh, yeah. The other guy. I can't think of his name. I could picture him, but yeah.
Super smart,
yeah.
Right? Super smart, very verbally adept. And, he's been asked about the documents, and he's a lawyer, and he's just dissembling, right? He's like, sorry, man, I know you actually don't really believe that, but you're playing a chess game here. But you're playing a chess game with American security, with the welfare of America. I'm sorry, these are nuclear secrets. Don't play a cat and mouse game with me about, well, there's like locks on the bathrobe. Fuck you, man. You know what I mean? In some ways, like, he's probably a more reasonable candidate policy-wise, but I actually respect him less because I hate it when people dissemble and lie on purpose. I hate it. I think it, and Democrats do it too, and I absolutely loathe them for it.
Fair enough, man. No, I love that. Thanks for that detour with me. We got a little time left, and I want to, before we talk about where people can get the book and what you might be working on next. There was this discussion point about I forget where I saw it or heard it that you talked about. I don't think it was in your books, where, and you suffered from this short-term PTSD, short-term PTSD. You suffered after being a wartime reporter pre 9/11, right? Northern Alliance, you were with the North, well, not with, but you were in the Northern Alliance territory as they were fighting the Taliban pre 9/11. And you came back and realized later that you had short-term PTSD. And I think you cited this stat that it's like 10% of active duty members go through wartime battles, but 40 or 50% suffer from PTSD and or on maybe on disability. For you can correct the stat. I don't know exactly which one it was, but what does that mean? What does that say? Why is that? What is the rate of PTSD amongst non-combatants even say about tribalism?
I was in all kinds of civil wars before I was with American soldiers. So I was in northern Afghanistan with Northern Alliance. I was in Africa. I was in Afghanistan in 1996 while the Taliban were taking over. So most of my combat experience was not with American soldiers. And when I had some rather extreme reactions to it before anyone, before I even knew the term PTSD, I just thought I was going crazy. Like I came home from Afghanistan in the fall of 2000, and every time I tried to take the subway, I would panic because I was in a small enclosed space with a lot of people, a typical trigger for someone who's been traumatized, and I couldn't take the subway. I'd run out and I'd walk or take a taxi or something. And I was like, damn, you're 38 years old and you're finally going crazy. What a bummer. I had no idea it had anything to do with Afghanistan. There were no subways in Afghanistan. Why would I, but it's not about that, right? It's just situations where you feel that you're not in control trigger extreme anxiety if you've been traumatized, right? So the statistics, with the military are infuriatingly elusive. The proportion of soldiers that are in combat depends on how you define combat. It's as high as 1 out of 3. It's as low as 1 out of 10, right? The number of soldiers that were, do you count all American soldiers, even ones who stayed in the U.S.? Do you count the ones who were in Kuwait? Do you count the soldiers who were in theater but never left the FOB, like never left Bagram Air Base, which took a mortar round every 6 months, but that's not really, how do you count
Sure.
how do you do the numbers, right? But suffice it to say that way more people, wherever you sort of put the pegs, right, the pins, way more people claim PTSD, way more veterans claim PTSD than were in full on combat, stand up over the sandbags and unload a mag into the enemy, like that kind of combat. Like far more soldiers than experience that have claimed PTSD. Why is that? If you're super cynical, which I'm not, but if you want to be super cynical, you'd say, well, it's just a government paycheck, right? Like who's going to argue with you? You were in Afghanistan. You thought you might get killed, and you could always get taken out by an IED and $3,000 a month from the government. Great. So there's that explanation. That's probably some of it. But then there's a little bit more forgiving explanation, which is this, and this is what one of the things tribe is about. Trauma dissipates fairly quickly, right? Only about 20% of traumatized people wind up with a long-lasting psychological problem, right? The other 80% have recovered to within normal measures within about a year, right? But what's very hard to recover from is feeling like you're not part of a community. So with soldiers, you pick them up, you train them, you send them overseas, they're in a platoon. Even if the platoon's not in combat, the sort of group dynamics of a platoon are very intense. They're very gratifying, even if you're a freaking supply clerk, right? And then you pick them up and you drop them back down in America, and they go back to their, single family home or whatever it is, and they crash, right? They get depressed. One quarter of Peace Corps volunteers wind up struggling with significant depression when they come home, and they weren't in combat. So what happens is if you're a soldier and you were overseas and you come back and you're depressed, you're like, oh, PTSD, it has to be, I'm a soldier. It has nothing to do with trauma. And the problem with the military not recognizing a kind of post-deployment alienation disorder, the problem is that it forces honest people to look for trauma where it didn't really happen because they're trying to explain a psychological struggle they're having. They're trying to get compensation from the government, all legitimate goals. Maybe a mortar hit a mile away at Bagram Air Base, and that's their trauma, but they know they're inflating it, and so does the government. Why force someone to do that if you acknowledge that being put into a tight community and then wrenched out of it and put back in America, which is an rather solitary, alienated community, that's going to have consequences. If you recognize that, then people wouldn't have to make up trauma in order to get some kind of psychological help and financial help.
That is an amazing, I don't know, endorsement of the power of community and tribe. I'm telling you, like when I read about you and learned about you and saw, I mean, especially the book Tribe, and then thought about what this community has been for somebody like me, right? Who, not that I'm, like wild, like you said, I've had some financial success, good for me. But it does get lonely when you're not, willing to have a W-2 job or willing to be in the same position as most of who you grew up with or are friends with. So the way you just described that, the importance of tribe, the importance of community is just, I don't know. I really appreciate you bringing what you have to the world. So go ahead.
I'll add this to it because I thank you for that, and I think it's something that we should all know and understand because it affects us. My wife was the youngest of 12. Her dad was 55 when she was born. He fought the entirety of World War II as a lieutenant and a captain in the infantry from North Africa to Sicily to Anzio, all through Italy, D-Day, all the way through France, all the way to Austria. I mean, imagine what that man saw. Imagine the losses in his platoon and in his company, the trauma. He came back to where, the town in the Midwest where he was from, and all 6 of his brothers had also served, and they all lived within a few blocks of him, right? You talk about community, right? You don't have to, this doesn't have to be, a tribal society in 1800. America, even within a couple of generations ago, was a sort of communitarian, neighborhood-oriented society. It no longer is. That is inconceivable today, that something like that. And I'm sure it was quite common. He went on to become the mayor of his town and to become the president of a savings and loan that helped a lot of people and a lot of farmers and, whatever. He was part of the community. And I'm sure that I didn't know him. He passed before I met my wife, but I'm sure he considered his service after the World War II, his service as a mayor and as a small town bank president just as important as his service on, at Anzio Beach.
Wow. I honestly, I was just glancing over. I got like pages more questions. I should have tried to get 2 hours out of your publisher to bring you on, but I'll let you go on that. I want to respect your time. Freedom is the book. Tribe, I would recommend picking up both. Again, easy, quick reads with a lot of information. I'm doing this carnivore diet, and a term that comes up with meat is nutrient dense, and I feel like that's your books, right? They're not long. They're Joe Rogan podcasts, honestly, to listen to. They're 2.5, 3 hours. Listen to it at 2x speed. You can get it done in an hour and a half, but they're amazingly dense, amazingly interesting, incredibly researched. And even, I used the term earlier, I meant to say this, American Indian, and you got to read the beginning of Tribe to find out why I align now. Like, okay, that makes sense why you use that term. You gave a great explanation as to even why you use that term. So much information in these books. Really appreciate it. What are you working on now? What else should we be looking forward to?
I'm writing a book called Pulse, a memoir of dying and living. I almost died 3 years ago when I had a ruptured aneurysm. I think I told you.
You did.
The mortality rate is 70%, 70 for what I had. I managed to live. I'm an atheist. I'm a rationalist. I'm not religious. And as I was dying, and I was still talking to the doctor, but I was minutes from dead. My dead father appeared above me to welcome me, and I'm still trying to explain it. Apparently, it's a very common experience. I don't know what it means, but I'm trying to figure it out. And so that book will be out hopefully next spring.
Well, if you're up for it, I'd love to have you back on to talk about it. I heard that entire story of you not questioning whether or not you're an atheist anymore, but more trying to unpack and understand exactly what the meaning of what you saw was and how close you were to death. I forget where I heard the story. So yeah, I'm looking forward to Pulse. I'll keep that on my radar.
Awesome. I'd love to come back on your show. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.